Jake Harrison sat in his chair, looking at the screens that covered the wall in front of him. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of machines that never stopped working. He had been doing this job for 3 years now, and every day was the same. Watch the screens and listen for signals from space. Most days nothing happened at all, Doc. The lunar station Alpha was built on the dark side of the moon where Earth could not block the signals coming from deep space. Jake and his team worked in shifts to make sure someone was always listening. They were looking for signs of life beyond Earth, but so far they had found nothing except empty space and dying stars. Jake rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on the wall. His shift would end in 2 hours, and he could go back to his small room and sleep. He reached for his coffee cup when suddenly one of the screens started flashing red. A signal was coming through from somewhere far away in space. The signal was weak, but it was definitely not natural. Jake had heard natural sounds from space before, like radio waves from pulsars and the background noise of the universe itself. This was different. This was made by someone or something that was trying to communicate. Jake pressed the button that would record everything and called for Dr. Lisa Morgan to come to the communication center right away. Lisa was the best person on the station at understanding languages and codes. If anyone could figure out what this signal meant, it would be her. Lisa arrived within minutes, still wearing her lab coat from whatever she had been working on before. Her hair was pulled back, and her face looked serious as she sat down at the computer next to Jake. She put on her headphones and listened to the signal while watching the patterns appear on her screen. The signal kept repeating the same pattern over and over again. It would play for about 30 seconds, then start again from the beginning. Lisa worked for hours trying to understand what it meant, while Jake watched the screens for any other signals that might be connected to this one. After 6 hours, Lisa took off her headphones and looked at Jake with worry in her eyes. She had figured out that it was definitely a language, but it was unlike any human language that had ever existed. The structure was completely different from how humans put words together, but it followed rules that showed intelligence. Lisa worked for 3 days straight, only stopping to eat and take short naps. Jake brought her food and coffee while she filled page after page with notes and drawings. Other people from the station came to watch, but Lisa was too focused on her work to notice them. On the 3rd day, Lisa suddenly stood up from her chair and looked at Jake with tears in her eyes. She had broken the code and understood what the message was saying. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the pages of translation she had written. Lisa read the message out loud to Jake and the other people who had gathered in the room. The words made everyone go quiet as they realized what they were hearing. Someone from another world was asking for help, and they were dying. The message said they were called the Kalari, and they lived near a star called Epsilon Eridani, which was about 10 light years away from Earth. Their world was being attacked by something called the hegemony, which was destroying everything on their planet. The Kalari were begging anyone who could hear their message to help them, because they did not have much time left. Jake felt his heart beating fast as he listened to Lisa read the translation. This was the moment that everyone at the station had been hoping for, but also feared. They had found proof that humans were not alone in the universe, but these other beings were in terrible danger. The message included information about where the Kalari lived and what was attacking them. The hegemony was described as machines that consumed everything they found and turned it into more machines. They had already destroyed most of the Kalari cities and were killing millions of innocent people. Lisa played the audio recordings that came with the message, and everyone in the room could hear the fear and sadness in the voices of the Kalari, even though they could not understand the language. There were sounds of explosions and screaming in the background that made it clear these people were suffering terribly. The Kalari had sent pictures along with their message that showed what their world looked like before the attack. It was a beautiful blue and green planet with vast oceans and floating cities that looked like something from a dream. The people themselves looked like a mix between humans and dolphins, with smooth skin and large, intelligent eyes. But the recent pictures showed burning cities and dead bodies floating in poisoned water. The machines of the hegemony were everywhere, destroying everything they touched. The Kalari had fought bravely, but their weapons were not strong enough to stop the invasion. Jake knew they had to send this message to Earth right away. This was too important for just the people on the lunar station to handle. He opened a direct communication line to the Earth Defense Command and sent everything they had received, including Lisa's translation and all the pictures and audio files. Within an hour, Jake received a call from General Paul Davis, who was in charge of Earth's military forces. The general told Jake that President Helen Carter had been informed about the message and was calling an emergency meeting of all the world's leaders. This was the most important moment in human history. Jake looked at Lisa, who was still staring at the translated message in her hands. Both of them knew that everything was about to change. Humans had always wondered if they were alone in the universe, and now they knew they were not. But more than that, they knew there were good people out there who needed help. Lisa wiped the tears from her eyes and looked at Jake with determination. She said that the Kalari message had mentioned that they only had days left before their entire species would be wiped out. If humans were going to help them, they would have to act very quickly. Jake nodded and looked back at the screens that were still showing the repeating signal from the dying world. He thought about all the times he had sat in this room hoping to find signs of life in space. Now that he had found it, he realized that finding life also meant finding death and suffering. And people who needed help. The communication center was now full of people from all over the station who had come to hear about the message. Everyone was talking at once about what this meant and what Earth should do about it. Some people were excited about making contact with aliens, while others were worried about getting involved in a war that was happening so far away. But Jake looked at the pictures of the Kalari children who were running from the machines, and he knew there was only one right thing to do. If someone was asking for help, and humans had the power to give that help, then they had to try. It did not matter that these people lived on another world, or that they looked different from humans. As Jake's shift finally ended, he knew he would not be sleeping tonight. None of them would be sleeping until they knew what Earth was going to do about the message. The whole world was about to learn that they were not alone, and that sometimes being part of a bigger universe meant helping strangers who lived among the stars. President Helen Carter sat in the White House Situation Room, looking at the faces of world leaders on screens around the room. She had called this emergency meeting just 4 hours after receiving the message from the lunar station, and already every major country on Earth was represented. This was moving faster than any international crisis in human history. The Secretary General of the United Nations spoke first, explaining what they knew about the Kalari and their desperate situation. The translation had been checked by language experts from 12 different countries, and they all agreed that the message was real. Somewhere in space, people were dying, and they had asked Earth for help. General Paul Davis stood up and pointed to a large display showing the Epsilon Eridani star system. He explained that the Kalari homeworld was about 10 light years away, which meant it would take current human spacecraft many decades to reach them. But the message had also included detailed information about the hegemony machines that were attacking them. Amanda Foster, who led Earth's most advanced computer research team, had spent the last 3 hours studying the technical data from the Kalari message. She stood up and told the room that the hegemony was not as advanced as everyone had feared. Their technology was actually behind what humans had developed in some important ways. The hegemony machines were designed to overwhelm primitive civilizations with massive numbers of simple robots. They had never faced an enemy that could adapt. quickly or use complex strategies. D.R. Foster explained that human military technology was actually superior to the hegemony in several key areas, including weapon systems and space travel. This news changed everything in the room. What had seemed like an impossible rescue mission was now looking like something humans might actually be able to do. The question was no longer whether Earth could help the Kaleri, but whether Earth should get involved in a war on the other side of the galaxy. President Carter looked around the room at the faces of prime ministers and presidents from every continent. She could see that most of them were thinking the same thing she was. How could they ignore people who were begging for help when they had the power to save them? The president of Russia spoke up and said that his country would contribute ships and weapons to any rescue mission. The prime minister of China agreed and offered to share their most advanced manufacturing capabilities. One by one, the world leaders pledged their support for helping the Kaleri, even though it would cost enormous amounts of money and resources. But it was not just the governments that were responding to the Kaleri message. News of the alien plea for help had leaked to the public and was spreading across the internet faster than anyone could control it. People all over Earth were learning that they were not alone in the universe and that somewhere in space innocent people were being murdered by machines. Social media exploded with messages of support for the Kaleri. People who had never agreed on anything before were united in their anger at the hegemony and their determination to help the alien refugees. Protest marches formed in major cities, demanding that their governments take action to save the dying. Civilization. Jake Harrison watched the news coverage from his room on the lunar station and was amazed at how quickly the whole world had come together. He had expected people to be afraid of making contact with aliens, but instead they seemed to be inspired by the chance to help someone in need. Lisa Morgan was also watching the news while continuing to work on translating more parts of the Kaleri message. She had found additional files that contained detailed information about Kaleri culture and history. The more she learned about them, the more she realized how similar they were to humans in their values and dreams. The Kaleri had been a peaceful species that spent most of their time creating art and exploring the oceans of their world. They had only developed space travel recently and had never built weapons capable of fighting off an invasion like the one they were facing. They were completely defenseless against the hegemony machines. General Davis was working around the clock to figure out how Earth could mount a rescue mission to a star system 10 light years away. The fastest human spacecraft would normally take over 100 years to make such a journey, but the Kaleri message had included information about advanced propulsion systems that might make the trip possible in less than a year. Engineering teams from NASA and the European Space Agency were already working together to design new spacecraft based on the Kaleri technical data. They were combining human weapons technology with alien propulsion systems to create ships that could fight the hegemony and win. Dr. Foster made another important discovery while studying the hegemony data. The machines had a weakness that the Kaleri had not been able to exploit, but humans might be able to use. The hegemony relied on a central command system that coordinated all their actions. If that system could be destroyed or disrupted, the entire invasion force would become confused and vulnerable. This gave human military planners a clear objective for their mission. They would not need to destroy every hegemony machine on the Kaleri homeworld. They would just need to find and eliminate the central command node, and the rest of the invasion force would collapse. Construction began immediately on the first human interstellar war fleet. Factories that had been making cars and electronics were converted overnight to produce weapons and spacecraft components. Workers volunteered for extra shifts, knowing that every hour of delay meant more Kaleri would die. The first ship to be completed was named the USS Vengeance to reflect humanity's anger at what the hegemony had done to innocent people. It was followed by the USS Retribution and the USS Salvation, each equipped with the most advanced weapons that human science could create. Colonel Steve Adams volunteered to lead the first wave of human ground forces that would land on the Kalari homeworld. Within days, he had more volunteers than he could use as soldiers from every country on Earth applied to join the mission. Everyone wanted to be part of the force that would answer the alien cry for help. The volunteers came from every branch of the military and every walk of life. There were career soldiers who had been fighting wars for decades, and young recruits who had just finished basic training. There were engineers and doctors and pilots and mechanics, all united by their determination to save the Kalari. Colonel Adams organized intensive training programs where human soldiers learned everything they could about fighting the hegemony machines. They practiced in simulated environments based on the data from the Kalari message and learned to work together as a single unified force. Despite coming from different countries and military traditions, meanwhile, engineer Katie Bell was leading a different kind of preparation. She was designing hospital ships and medical facilities that could treat wounded Kalari and help refugees who survived the hegemony attack. Her team was learning everything they could about Kalari biology and psychology so they would be ready to provide proper care. Katie knew that the human mission would not be a success just because they defeated the hegemony. They would also need to help the surviving Kalari rebuild their civilization and recover from the trauma of watching their world being destroyed. This was going to be as much a humanitarian mission as a military one. The preparations were happening so fast that it seemed impossible, but everyone involved knew they were racing against time. Every day that passed meant more Kalari were dying, and their civilization was getting closer to complete extinction. The human fleet had to launch as soon as possible, even if it meant taking risks that would normally be considered unacceptable. President Carter addressed the world on television 6 months after the first message had been received. She announced that the human rescue fleet was ready to launch and that Earth was committed to saving the Kalari no matter what the cost. She said that this was humanity's chance to prove that they deserved to be part of the galactic community. As Jake Harrison watched the president's speech from the lunar station, he thought about how much had changed since that quiet night when he first detected the alien signal. The whole world had been transformed by a simple message asking for help, and now humans were about to embark on the greatest adventure in their history. The rescue fleet would launch in just a few days, and then there would be months of travel through the emptiness of space before they reached the Kalari homeworld. Jake wondered what they would find when they got there, and whether they would arrive in time to save anyone. But he knew that, regardless of the outcome, humanity had already proven something important about themselves by deciding to try. Admiral Ben Taylor stood on the bridge of the USS Terra's Wrath and watched Earth grow smaller in the main display screen. The human rescue fleet had launched just 8 months after receiving the Kalari distress signal, which was the fastest military mobilization in human history. Now 12 ships were heading toward the Epsilon Eridani system, carrying the hopes of every person on Earth. The Terra's Wrath was the largest spacecraft ever built by humans and served as the flagship for the entire rescue mission. Its hull was covered with weapon systems, and its interior was packed with everything the fleet might need for a long campaign far from home. Admiral Taylor had served in the Navy for 30 years, but he had never commanded anything like this before. Behind the Terra's Wrath were 11 other ships, each designed for a specific purpose. There were warships like the USS Vengeance and USS Retribution that carried enough firepower to destroy small moons. There were troop transports filled with soldiers and Marines who had trained for months to fight the hegemony machines. And there were hospital ships ready to treat wounded Kalari and provide medical care to survivors. The journey to Epsilon Eridani would take 8 months using the new propulsion systems that human engineers had developed based on Kalari technology. This was still much faster than any human spacecraft had ever traveled before, but it felt painfully slow. When they knew that people were dying while they crossed the emptiness of space, Dr. Peter Chun was the fleet's chief scientist, and he spent the journey studying every piece of information they had about the hegemony and their methods. His laboratory on the Terra's Wrath was filled with computer models and simulations that helped him understand how the enemy machines operated and what their weaknesses might be. Dr. Chun had discovered that the hegemony followed the same pattern every time. They invaded a new world. First, they would destroy the planet's military forces and government. Then they would begin systematically harvesting resources and converting organic life into raw materials for building more machines. Finally, they would strip the planet bare and move on to find their next victim. According to the data from the Kalari message, the hegemony had already conquered 17 different civilizations using exactly this approach. They had never faced serious resistance because they always attacked species that were much less advanced than themselves. The Kalari had been unlucky enough to be discovered just as they were beginning to explore space. But Dr. Chun realized that the hegemony had made a mistake by attacking the Kalari. The dolphin-like aliens had managed to send out their distress signal before their communication systems were completely destroyed. For the first time in the hegemony's history, their victims had called for help, and that help was coming. Intelligence officer Captain Nancy Wright worked closely with Dr. Chun to develop battle plans for every possible situation they might encounter when they reached the Kalari homeworld. They knew the hegemony would have orbital installations and ground-based facilities, but they did not know exactly how many machines they would be facing. Captain Wright's team used advanced computer simulations to test different attack strategies and find the ones most likely to succeed. They practiced coordinated strikes against hegemony command nodes and worked out detailed plans for evacuating Kalari survivors while the battle was still going on. The human fleet was not traveling alone through space. Every week new supply ships launched from Earth, carrying additional weapons, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The support mission had become the largest industrial effort in human history as entire countries focused their resources on supporting the rescue fleet. Engineer Katie Bell spent most of the journey preparing the hospital ships for the casualties they expected to treat. Her medical team had studied Kalari biology, using the data from their distress message, and had developed new treatments and procedures for treating alien patients. They had also prepared psychological counseling programs to help trauma survivors. Katie knew that many of the Kalari they rescued would be suffering from severe emotional damage after watching their entire civilization being destroyed. Her team had worked with experts in human psychology to develop methods for helping alien minds recover from experiences that no living being should have to endure. The journey also gave the human soldiers time to prepare mentally for what they were going to face. Colonel Steve Adams led training exercises in the ship's simulators where his troops practiced fighting hegemony machines in environments based on the Kalari homeworld. The soldiers learned to work together despite coming from different countries and military traditions. Many of the younger soldiers had never been in combat before, and Colonel Adams made sure they understood what they were getting into. They would be fighting an enemy that showed no mercy and took no prisoners. The hegemony machines would try to kill or capture every human they encountered and turn them into raw materials, just like they had done to millions of Kalari. But the soldiers were motivated by something stronger than fear. They had all seen the recordings of Kalari families fleeing from burning cities and children crying for parents who would never come home. Every person on the rescue fleet knew they were humanity's answer to a desperate plea for help from innocent people who had done nothing wrong. As the months passed during the journey, the human fleet received updates from Earth about what was happening back home. The entire planet was following the mission and supporting it in every way possible. Children in schools were drawing pictures for the Kalari survivors they hoped the fleet would rescue. Scientists were working on new technologies that might help rebuild the Kalari homeworld. The most important updates came from the Lunar Station Alpha, where Jake Harrison and Dr. Lisa Morgan continued to monitor signals from the Epsilon Eridani system. Unfortunately, they had not received any new messages from the Kalari since the original distress call. This could mean that the hegemony had destroyed all the Kalari communication systems, or it could mean something much worse. Admiral Taylor tried not to think about the possibility that they might arrive too late to save anyone. The fleet was traveling as fast as human technology could manage, but space was vast, and 8 months was a long time for people to survive under attack. All they could do was hope that some Kalari had found places to hide until help arrived. Dr. Chon made one more important discovery during the Dali journey when he analyzed the technical specifications of hegemony weapons and defenses. The machines were designed to fight against primitive laser weapons and kinetic projectiles like bullets and missiles. They had never faced the fusion-powered weapons and particle beam systems that the human fleet was carrying. This meant that human weapons would be much more effective against hegemony machines than anything the Kalari had been able to use. The enemy's armor and shields were not designed to stop the advanced energy weapons that human scientists had developed. Captain Wright immediately began revising her battle plans to take advantage of this tactical superiority. As the fleet approached the halfway point of their journey, Admiral Taylor addressed all the crews over the ship's communication system. He reminded them that they were not just soldiers and sailors on a military mission. They were representatives of the entire human species, and they carried the responsibility of showing the galaxy what kind of people humans really were. The Admiral said that humans had always been explorers and helpers who reached out to others in need. From the earliest days when people helped their neighbors survive harsh winters to the modern era, when countries sent aid to disaster victims on the other side of the world, humans had always believed in helping those who could not help themselves. Now they had the chance to extend that tradition beyond Earth, to include people who lived among the stars. The Kalari had asked for help, and humans had answered that call, even though it meant traveling across impossible distances and risking their lives to fight an enemy they had never seen before. Lieutenant Commander Tony Rodriguez was one of the fighter pilots who would lead the first attack when they reached the Epsilon Eridani system. He spent hours every day in the flight simulator, practicing combat maneuvers against computer-generated hegemony ships. Tony had grown up dreaming of flying in space, but he had never imagined he would be fighting to save an alien civilization. As the fleet entered the final months of their journey, long-range sensors began picking up signals from their destination. The news was both good and bad. The sensors detected massive hegemony installations throughout the Epsilon Eridani system, showing that the enemy was still there in large numbers. But they also detected faint life signs on the surface of the Kalari homeworld. This meant that some Kalari had survived the invasion and were still alive after more than a year of fighting. Admiral Taylor felt a mixture of relief and urgency when he heard this news. They were not too late, but they would need to act quickly to save whoever was still alive down there. The human fleet began making final preparations for battle as they approached the edge of the Epsilon Eridani system. Weapons were charged, engines were tested, and every system was checked to make sure it would work perfectly when the fighting started. In just a few more weeks, they would find out if humanity's greatest rescue mission would succeed or fail. Admiral Ben Taylor gave the order to attack at exactly 600-hour ship time as the human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Epsilon Eridani system. The sight that greeted them was worse than anyone had imagined. The Kalari homeworld was surrounded by massive hegemony installations that looked like metal spiders wrapped around a dying planet. The ocean world that had once been blue and green, according to the Kalari message, was now brown and gray. Huge processing facilities floated in orbit, sucking up material from the planet's surface and converting it into more machines. The hegemony had been busy during the months it took the human fleet to arrive, and their numbers had grown enormously. But the humans had not come this far to be intimidated by the size of the enemy force. Admiral Taylor's battle plan was simple and direct. The USS Terra's Wrath and her escort ships would attack the main orbital installations, while the smaller warships moved in to destroy the hegemony's fleet. At the same time, the troop transports would head for the planet's surface to begin rescue operations. Lieutenant Commander Tony Rodriguez led the first wave of human fighters into battle, flying his ship through the debris field that had once been the Kalari Space Defense Force. Pieces of alien spacecraft drifted past his cockpit window, reminding him of what the hegemony had already destroyed. His anger grew with every piece of wreckage he saw. The hegemony response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of machine ships poured out of the orbital installations, like angry insects swarming toward the human fleet. But the aliens had made a critical mistake. They were using the same tactics that had worked against 17 previous civilizations, without realizing that humans fought differently. Hegemony ships moved in perfect formation following pre-programmed attack patterns that left no room for creativity or adaptation. The human ships scattered in all directions using unpredictable flight paths and coordinated attacks that the enemy computers could not anticipate. Within minutes, the space around the Kalari homeworld became a chaotic battlefield. Captain Nancy Wright coordinated the human attack from the Terra's Wrath, watching dozens of tactical displays that showed the positions of every ship in both fleets. She had spent months planning for this moment, and now her strategies were being tested in real combat. The humans were outnumbered 10-1, but they were fighting smarter. The first major success came when Tony Rodriguez's fighter squadron broke through the hegemony's defensive screen and launched a coordinated missile attack against one of the largest orbital installations. The station exploded in a brilliant flash of light that could be seen from the planet's surface. The human weapons were working exactly as Dr. Chon had predicted, but the real breakthrough came when the USS Vengeance managed to get close enough to the hegemony command station to launch its most powerful weapon. The fusion torpedo punched through the enemy's shields like they were made of paper and detonated inside the station's central core. The explosion was so bright that it temporarily blinded the optical sensors on nearby ships. The destruction of the command station had an immediate effect on the entire hegemony fleet. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly began making random movements as their central control system went offline. Some machines stopped fighting entirely, while others began attacking their own allies in confusion. Admiral Taylor seized the opportunity and ordered all human ships to press their attack. The USS Retribution and USS Salvation moved in to destroy the remaining orbital installations, while the fighter squadrons hunted down the scattered hegemony ships. The enemy's numerical advantage meant nothing when their ships could not work together effectively. On the planet's surface, Colonel Steve Adams was leading the first wave of human Marines in a desperate race to reach the Kalari survivors before the hegemony ground forces could eliminate them. His drop ships landed in the polar regions where long-range sensors had detected the strongest life signs. What the Marines found when they reached the surface was beyond horrifying. The hegemony had built massive processing centers where living Kalari were being converted into raw materials for building more machines. The sounds coming from these facilities were unlike anything the human soldiers had ever heard before. Colonel Adams ordered his troops to attack the processing centers immediately, even though they were heavily defended by hegemony ground units. The Marines fought with a fury that surprised even themselves as they saw what the machines had been doing to innocent people. These were not military targets or strategic objectives. These were torture chambers. Commander Julie Adams led her unit through the twisted metal corridors of the largest processing facility looking for survivors among the machinery of death. What she found there would stay with her for the rest of her life. Thousands of Kalari had been killed in the most horrible ways imaginable while the machines harvested their bodies for useful materials. But Julie also found something else in the depths of the facility. A group of Kalari children who had been hiding in a damaged section of the building for weeks, living on scraps of food and contaminated water. When they saw the human soldiers approaching, they cowered in fear, thinking that these were just more machines coming to kill them. Dr. Lisa Morgan was among the first humans to make direct contact with living Kalari when she arrived at the processing facility with the medical team. She had spent over a year learning their language, and now she was finally able to speak with them face to face. The first words she said in their language were meant to comfort and reassure them that help had finally arrived. The Kalari children could barely believe what they were hearing. Someone had actually answered their people's desperate call for help. Beings from another world had traveled across the vast darkness of space to save them from the machines that had destroyed everything they had ever known. They clung to Dr. Morgan and the other humans like they were afraid this was all a dream. The battle in space was reaching its climax as the human fleet systematically destroyed the remaining hegemony installations. The enemy had lost their ability to coordinate their forces, and their ships were being picked off one by the superior human weapons. Admiral Taylor realized that they were actually going to win this fight, but victory in space meant nothing if they could not save the Kalari survivors on the planet's surface. Engineer Katie Bell was coordinating the evacuation efforts from her hospital ship in orbit, receiving injured aliens and traumatized refugees as fast as the transport ships could bring them up from the surface. Katie's medical team had prepared for months to treat alien patients, but nothing could have prepared them for the condition of the Kalari they were rescuing. Many were suffering from severe malnutrition and injuries from living in hiding for over a year. Others were in shock from watching their families and friends being murdered by the machines. The worst cases were the Kalari, who had been partially processed by the hegemony facilities before the human attack interrupted the procedure. These survivors had been subjected to procedures that were designed to keep them alive while their bodies were slowly converted into raw materials. Katie's team worked around the clock to save as many of these victims as possible. Dr. Peter Chun was studying the wreckage of destroyed hegemony ships to learn more about their technology and methods. What he discovered made him realize just how close the Kalari had come to complete extinction. The machines had been preparing to move on to their next target within days of the human fleet's arrival. The hegemony had already identified several other nearby civilizations that they planned to attack after finishing with the Kalari. Their long-term strategy involved consuming entire sections of the galaxy one star system at a time until they had converted all organic life into mechanical components for their ever-growing fleet. But the arrival of the human fleet had completely disrupted these plans. The hegemony had never encountered resistance from a technologically advanced species before, and their rigid programming could not adapt to the new situation. They had been designed to overwhelm primitive civilizations, not to fight enemies who could match or exceed their capabilities. As the last hegemony ships were destroyed or driven from the system, Admiral Taylor received reports from the surface that the rescue operations were proceeding successfully. Thousands of Kalari survivors had been found in hiding places throughout the polar regions and were being evacuated to the hospital ships for medical treatment. But the numbers were heartbreaking. Out of a population that had once numbered in the billions, only about 50,000 Kalari had survived the hegemony invasion. An entire civilization had been reduced to a tiny group of refugees who had lost everything except their lives and their memories of what their world had been like before the machines came. The human fleet had won a complete victory over the hegemony forces, But the cost of that victory was measured in the billions of lives that had been lost before help could arrive. Admiral Taylor stood on the bridge of the Terra's Wrath, looking down at the damaged planet below, and wondered if they had really won anything at all. But then he received a message from Dr. Morgan on the surface. The Kalari survivors wanted to thank the humans for answering their call for help. 3 months after the battle, Admiral Ben Taylor walked through the newly constructed refugee camp on the northern continent of the Kalari homeworld and marveled at how much had been accomplished in such a short time. Where once there had been only burned ruins and twisted metal, now there were clean buildings, powered by human technology and surrounded by gardens where Kalari children played safely. The camp housed nearly 40,000 Kalari survivors who were slowly beginning to rebuild their lives with human help. Engineers from Earth had worked alongside Kalari technical experts to design structures that could function both above and below water, since the dolphin-like aliens were equally comfortable in both environments. Dr. Katie Bell supervised the main medical facility where human doctors and nurses continued to treat Kalari patients who were still recovering from injuries and trauma suffered during the hegemony occupation. Many of the survivors had physical wounds that were healing well, but the emotional damage would take much longer to repair. Katie had learned to recognize the signs of severe psychological trauma in her alien patients. Many of them woke up screaming from nightmares about machines chasing them through burning cities. Others refused to sleep at all because they were afraid the hegemony would return while they were not watching. The human medical team was learning how to help minds that had been broken by experiences no living being should have to endure, but there were also signs of hope and recovery throughout the camp. Kalari families who had been separated during the invasion were being reunited as human search teams continued to find survivors in remote locations across the planet. Children who had not laughed in over a year were beginning to play games again, and elderly Kalari were starting to tell stories about what their civilization had been like before the machines came. Colonel Steve Adams had established a permanent human garrison in the system to protect the Kalari survivors and help them rebuild their military capabilities. His soldiers were no longer fighting battles, but they were still serving an important mission by providing security and assistance to people who had lost everything. The colonel spent most of his time training Kalari volunteers who wanted to learn how to defend themselves and their families. The surviving aliens had realized that they could never again depend entirely on the goodwill of others for protection. They needed to develop their own ability to fight back against any future threats. The most important work being done in the system was not military or medical, but cultural and educational. Dale Lisa Morgan had established a project to record and preserve everything the surviving Kalari could remember about their lost civilization. She knew that rebuilding their society would require more than just new buildings and technology. Lisa worked with Kalari historians and artists to create a comprehensive archive of their species, achievements in science, art, literature, and philosophy. Much of this knowledge had been stored in computers that were destroyed during the invasion, but the survivors carried irreplaceable memories that needed to be preserved for future generations. The human fleet had also recovered thousands of Kalari artifacts from the ruins of their cities. These objects ranged from simple household items to complex scientific instruments that provided clues about how the aliens had lived before the hegemony attack. Each artifact was carefully cataloged and studied to help rebuild the lost knowledge of an entire civilization. Engineer Tony Rodriguez had volunteered to stay in the system after the battle to help with the reconstruction efforts. His skills as a pilot were not needed now that the fighting was over, but his knowledge of advanced technology was invaluable for building the infrastructure that the Kalari would need to survive and prosper. Tony was leading a project to construct underwater cities based on traditional Kalari designs, but incorporating human environmental controls and power systems. The new settlements would be much more defensible than the original floating cities and would provide secure homes for thousands of survivors. The reconstruction work was being supported by a steady stream of supply ships from Earth carrying everything, from construction materials to educational resources. The entire human species had adopted the Kalari survivors and was committed to helping them rebuild their civilization regardless of the cost. But the most remarkable discovery had come from the Kalari themselves. While searching through the ruins of their primary communication facility, human technicians had found a hidden database that contained information about other civilizations throughout the galaxy. The Kalari had been part of a loose network of peaceful species that shared knowledge and cultural exchanges. Dr. Peter Chun studied this galactic database and realized that it represented a treasure trove of information about dozens of other intelligent species. Many of these civilizations were probably unaware that the hegemony existed and were completely unprepared to defend themselves against a machine invasion. More disturbing was the discovery that the hegemony had been operating for thousands of years and had already destroyed hundreds of civilizations across multiple sectors of the galaxy. The attack on the Kalari homeworld had been just one small part of a much larger campaign of extermination that was still continuing. This information changed everything about humanity's role in the galaxy. The rescue of the Kalari had not been an isolated incident, but the first battle in what would probably be a much longer war against an enemy that threatened all organic life. Earth would need to prepare for the possibility of future conflicts on a scale that no one had previously imagined. President Helen Carter received regular updates about the situation in the Epsilon Eridani system and the implications of the galactic database. She authorized the construction of additional warships and the establishment of permanent human bases throughout the region to serve as early warning stations against future hegemony attacks. But the president also authorized something else that was equally important. Earth would begin sending messages to the other civilizations mentioned in the Kalari database to warn them about the hegemony threat and offer assistance in developing better defenses. Humanity was not going to wait for more desperate pleas for help to arrive. Admiral Taylor was placed in command of the new Galactic Defense Initiative with orders to coordinate humanity's response to threats against any peaceful species in the region. His first task was to analyze the hegemony's methods and develop strategies for protecting vulnerable civilizations before they could be attacked. The admiral realized that the key to defeating the Yomiev hegemony was not just superior weapons, but better coordination between potential victims. If the peaceful species of the galaxy could work together to share information and resources, they would have a much better chance of surviving future attacks. Back on Earth, Jake Harrison continued his work at the Lunar Station Alpha, but now he was listening for distress signals from dozens of different species, instead of just hoping to find signs of any alien life. His job had become much more important and much more urgent since the successful rescue of the Kalari. Jake had received messages of gratitude from Kalari survivors, who wanted to thank him personally for detecting their original distress signal and making sure it reached the right people on Earth. They understood that, without his dedication and skill, their entire species would have been extinct before help could arrive. Dr. Morgan split her time between the Kalari refugee camps and Earth, where she was establishing a new department of xenolinguistics at the United Nations. Her job was to prepare humanity for communication with the many other species they would probably encounter as they expanded their protective efforts throughout the galaxy. The most moving moment came 6 months after the battle, when the first group of Kalari children born after the rescue took their first steps in the rebuilt nursery facility. These babies would grow up knowing that their species had survived the worst catastrophe in their history, and that they were no longer alone in a hostile universe. The adult Kalari had begun referring to the human rescue fleet as the Promise Keepers. because they had kept the promise that all civilized beings make to help those in need. This name spread throughout the survivor community and eventually became the official designation for humanity's ongoing galactic protection mission. 1 year after the rescue, Admiral Taylor received the first response to humanity's message's warning. Other species about the hegemony threat, a civilization in the Vega system, had confirmed that machine scouts had been detected near their borders, and they were requesting assistance in developing better defenses. This was exactly what the Admiral had been expecting and preparing for. The human fleet immediately dispatched a task force to the Vega system carrying weapons, technology, defensive systems, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were not facing this threat alone. The galaxy was learning that humanity answered every call for help. The Kalari survivors had also made their own contribution to the galactic defense effort. Their scientists had developed new detection systems that could identify hegemony ships at much greater distances than previous technology allowed. This early warning capability would give threatened civilizations precious time to prepare for attack or call for assistance.